are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about the Prince of Darkness. Now, a series of attacks and murders with many witnesses, a killer's and a car's description, yet he still could not be caught. Survivors who had no idea who they had come in contact with, and crimes that didn't even appear to be connected. This killer seemed to be committing crimes 24/7, yet everyone around him said he lived a normal life. Besides the horrific things he would say and the awful things that no one knew he was doing. If you don't know, it is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you'd like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, giving this video a thumbs up, and leaving a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was actually 1990 in California, and Tiffany Paige Schultz lived in San Diego. She was a 20-year-old, petite, blue-eyed, curly-haired blonde. She was beautiful, and she lived in an apartment complex called the Canyon Ridge Complex. Now, this was actually across from the Buena Vista Gardens complex, which we will get to know greatly in this story. Now, she had grown up with an alcoholic father, and this had really kind of changed her childhood. She had to grow up very fast. It affected her life greatly, and even though he had sobered up in the recent years, she did go through this when she was a child. She also felt like her mother didn't really care about her, and so she had kind of a rough upbringing in that way. But Tiffany had grown up herself to be a caring, loving, gentle person who was very conservative in her thinking, and she had a brilliant mind. She loved reading books. In fact, she was studying at the San Diego State University to become an English professor. However, in order to reach her dreams, she would have to do a few things that she really didn't want to. Now, Tiffany had gotten a job at a club that was called Les Girls, and this was something she wasn't very proud of, but it was something that paid her bills and really helped her to do what she wanted to do. She was an independent girl. She had left home. She'd bought her own car, and so she really needed this money and to become an exotic dancer. Although it wasn't her passion or something she wanted to tell people about, she did it for that reason. She was working up the courage to leave, get another job, but she hadn't gotten the chance to yet, and she never would. Because on January 12th, she would be found deceased. A 28-year-old man named Christopher James Burns would actually call the police, and he said he walked into her apartment and found his roommate lying face up. Her legs were separated at a 60-degree angle, and there was blood on her crotch, her chest, her torso. She was also wearing bikini bottoms. Now, Tiffany Schultz had been Christopher's roommate as well as girlfriend. They lived together, and the medical examiner found that Tiffany had actually been stabbed 47 times, with 20 of those stab wounds going into her breast. Now, it was like in a circular pattern, and it was very much identifiable that this was something that this person had done on purpose. The blade also was plunged so deep into her body that it went almost all the way through her chest. She had bruises all over her body, especially her face. It appeared as though she had been beaten as well as stabbed, and she had also fought for her life. She even had strands of hair of somebody else in her clenched hand. This was immediately sent in to be tested, but she was also tested to see if she was sexually assaulted, and she was not, as they had first feared. When investigators first started looking at this crime scene, they found that there were no signs of forced entry other than the blood on the actual doorknob that was in a strange, like honeycomb looking pattern. It didn't appear it was fingerprints, and it was very strange. But other than that, it didn't look like anyone had entered or left this apartment. Tiffany lived on the second floor, so they could have, climbed to get in and then jumped to get out. The bathtub was wet. There was a damp towel nearby, as though somebody has been recently showering. Tiffany's neighbors were then questioned to see if they had heard or seen anything that day, and a few said that they did see her sunbathing inside her apartment, but nearby the balcony window, and she was in her bikini. And around 11 to 1 p.m., several neighbors claimed that they heard noises coming from above them. It sounded like someone was being beaten as well as the water running, but when the noises stopped, everyone thought everything was okay and they didn't go to check. Tiffany's friends came forward saying that they had talked to her over the phone that day, but this was like earlier in the morning, and then when they tried to call back at 12:30, nobody answered the phone, and this is when the most concerning tip came in. This was from the manager of this apartment complex. Her name was Dorothy Curtis, and she said that late morning, early afternoon, an African-American male had come into her office and asked her for a hanger. He said he was going to use it to break into his car that he had accidentally locked himself out of in the parking lot, and wanted to see if she had a hanger for him to borrow. So she eventually found this hanger, gave it to him, and she said that she watched as he proceeded to walk towards the apartment complex, not towards the parking lot, which she found really odd. This made her nervous, but she didn't, she couldn't say that he was going to do anything bad to go and stop him, so she just let him go. There was no sign of this hanger being inside Tiffany's apartment or that a hanger was used to kill her, so it really didn't appear to have any connection. But investigators already had a suspect in line, and this was Christopher Burns, Tiffany's roommate and boyfriend. You see, he had been with Tiffany for about a year by this point. People claimed that their relationship was an abusive one. Her friends claimed that Christopher would beat her all the time, and she was constantly trying to leave him and trying to get up the courage to get away from this situation, but her coworkers said that she would often show up with bruises on her wrists and her ankles, and she would say anytime she tried to leave him, he would tie her up and tell her she couldn't. She would tell her friends that Christopher loved to watch movies where men were violent towards their partners sexually, and that he was very aggressive when they were sexual with each other. And she would say that she kind of felt like she wanted to stay with him. She had to, because she had such low self-esteem and confidence, and it was hard for her to leave this toxic situation behind. Yet another friend claimed that Christopher would have never done this, that they had such a perfect relationship, and that they were always, talking about marriage, and Christopher was one of the mellowest guys that they knew, and that he wouldn't hurt a fly. But hearing the first statements about him being abusive, investigators did take him in to be questioned, and he refused to talk, claiming he was innocent, he had nothing to do with the murder. But within 3 days he was released because no further evidence was found to connect him or to say he was guilty at all. By this point, investigators were looking at the possibility of Tiffany's job as an exotic dancer being the reason why she was murdered, whether somebody had come in contact with her there, followed her home, or had been stalking her, or they had had a harsh encounter at her job. So they ended up going to this club, and they wanted to talk to some of the other dancers, but these dancers didn't really want to talk to them. However, they did get lucky with a manager who gave them a few brief statements. This manager said that around the time of her murder, a little before, they had a group of men who had come in, and one had gotten into an altercation of sorts with Tiffany. He had basically thrown up a wad of cash onto the stage, and it hit Tiffany, and she ended up yelling at him. He yelled back. They had a brief argument, and nothing more was said to come of this, but it was speculated that it could have been something that led to more, and this man could have been a lot angrier than they even knew. It's often said that these women who work as exotic dancers will have these men who get sort of an obsession with them and try to get close to them even outside of the club. They start to think that this dance that they had with them meant more than just them paying for a dance. This was a very real theory, but it wasn't what happened at all. And while Tiffany's case was slowly going cold, everyone began to think that nothing like this was going to happen again. But they were very wrong. A month later, a 21-year-old named Janine Marie Weinhold was found on February 16th. This was only 2 blocks away in the same apartment complex region, and it was happening all over again. Janine was also studying at the University of California and was on the 2nd floor of her apartment as well. Neighbors had heard noises coming from her apartment that morning, and once again, since they were neighbors, they didn't want to intrude on anything happening or, be nosy, so no one had checked on her. But Janine had actually had a roommate that she dropped off at school at around 9 a.m., or she was actually dropping her off at work. They went to school together, but her work started at 9 a.m., and she was going to pick her up when the shift was over, and Janine was always right on time. She never left her roommate waiting, but This day she did. She never answered the phone. Her roommate was completely confused, and eventually she got a ride home, but this was around 8 p.m., and so it was hours later when she would enter the apartment. And this is when she found the front door unlocked, and her gut told her that something was really bad, but nothing can prepare you for actually seeing a dead body. Because then she would find her roommate and friend lying on the floor with her legs and her arms spread apart. She was naked besides a bra, and she was already deceased. Once investigators arrived, they noticed that she had stab wounds in the same circular pattern near her breast as the first victim, Tiffany. That case was already unsolved, and they didn't have much hope for this one. Janine had been stabbed in her chest 22 times, and they were all deep as well. Immediately, they knew this was not a coincidence. There was no sign of forced entry. There was only those fingerprints that looked like honeycomb marks on the doorknobs, and there was a few things that was different, though. Janine's clothes were actually in a pile beside her, and they appeared as though they had been ripped off her body. There was also a blood-stained knife with the tip bent that was in the kitchen sink, and she had a pile of damp clothes in a basket near the front door, as though she had just come in from doing laundry. Investigators began to believe that Janine, who didn't have an in-unit washer and dryer, had gone to wash her clothing and had brought them back up when this killer had come in behind her and attacked. Unfortunately, she had been sexually assaulted, unlike the first victim, and it appeared as though this killer was escalating his motive, and it was only the second victim. So investigators immediately sent a sample of the semen they had found on her to hopefully get the DNA. Meanwhile, another neighbor of Janine's came forward with some information. This was that around 11:30 that morning, between the time that Janine would have been home and her roommate getting home, this neighbor had seen a black man on the stairs, and he had his face in his hands. He appeared to be unhappy, and he was just sitting there. And so she went back in her apartment, and then shortly after this, she heard the loud noises coming from Janine's apartment, and then she was dead. Other than this sighting of this man that wasn't very specific, there were no suspects being found, and they really did fear this was going to be another unsolved case. To honor Janine, her parents decided to actually buy a playground for the South Claremont Park in her memory, but investigators feared this wasn't stopping with her and that this was going to happen again, and it did, right on time the next month. Yet the killer failed in this attempt. You see, it was around a month later, which is the usual time period for this killer, and in between kills, but investigators weren't called to a crime scene. A woman had just called to report that she had been attacked. She had no idea that she was almost the third victim of a serial killer. She had called to report that a man had followed her from the bus to her home on March 25th. She tried to hurry home. She saw him at the bottom of her stairs. She looked at him. He bent down to tie his shoes, but she realized they were already tied, so she hurried inside her apartment. She bolted and locked the door, and then she noticed that he was trying to get in her apartment. And he eventually left. But this was the door to her second-floor apartment of Buena Vista Gardens complex. Anna Costalisa Ritchie had survived, and she didn't even know what she had survived. But everything else matched the MO perfectly, everything except the actual killing, so this meant that this killer would not wait another month to kill again. And fortunately, it would only be a few weeks. It was now April, and 18-year-old Holly Suzanne Tarr was visiting San Diego. She was in high school, but she was on her spring break, and she really loved the arts. She wanted to be on Broadway or in movies. She was really planning for her future, and she had even gotten into the University of Michigan on a music scholarship. She was so happy, and she wanted to visit California because, that was a place where dreams come true, and she figured she might as well visit before going on to college. This was also lucky for her because her older brother, Richard, lived in San Diego, so she could go visit him and stay for free. Unfortunately, Richard lived at the Buena Vista Apartments, and he was more than happy to invite her and one of her girlfriends to come and stay with him. So on April 3rd, they were out having a good time while Richard was lifting some weights in the nearby little complex. They had like a pool and a place to play tennis, a place to lift weights, basically just a whole area where members of these apartment complexes nearby could go and sign in with just those people who lived there. And so they were playing tennis and going to the pool, and they didn't have to go far from home. But eventually at lunch, Holly decided she wanted to shower because she wanted to go shopping later. And her friend, who was Tammy, decided she was going to stay for about 10 more minutes just because Holly would need to shower first anyway. So she figured, I'll come up in 10 minutes when you're done and then I can shower and then we can go. So it was like the perfect little plan. And so Tammy went up around 10 minutes later. She was going to the door and she realized it was locked. She didn't have a key. Holly had the key, so she started, to knock on the door, and that's when she heard a scream, which she believed was coming from Holly inside. She had no key to get in, and she started to scream out, calling for Holly. No one was answering the door, and then she heard the phone ringing, but nobody answered the phone either. Eventually, Tammy went to the neighbor, asked them for help to call maintenance, so maintenance eventually came to unlock this door. But maintenance also had to bust open the door because the chain was on the door, keeping it closed. Little did they know this killer had not left yet, and so as Tammy ran inside to find Holly, a man came barreling out of the bedroom, running towards her. He fell onto the couch and ran out the front door. Tammy ran to Holly and found her gasping for air. An ambulance was called. Tammy held Holly in her arms as her friend passed away. The ambulance did not get there in time. She was found on the floor with her legs spread, and her undergarments were the only things on her body, and a towel was over her. Holly only had one stab wound to the heart, but it was enough to kill her. And Tammy told investigators that the man that she saw was wearing some sort of white covering or cloth over his face. He was wearing a red shirt, and he was holding a long knife as he ran out of the room. He had also taken Holly's opal ring, and Tammy then told them that this wasn't the first time these girls had seen this man. You see, Tammy said while they were out by the pool, they were, of course, looking around at cute boys and just having a good time as teenagers. And that's when they noticed a man working out in the gym area. He was in his 20s. He was well built. He was African American. And Tammy said he was lifting weights. And they made eye contact with him. And they pretty much, thought he was cute. And so this was like through the window because he was inside. They were outside at the pool. They just kind of moved on and didn't really talk to him at all. But this murder would blow this whole case of this killer wide open because Tammy had actually seen this man 2 times. And Holly's life had been brutally taken, but she had done so much afterwards to help catch this killer. You see, inside this apartment, the killer hadn't had time to clean up because he was caught in the act. So investigators found a shoe print near the door that was from a Nike Air Jordan. There was also a blood-stained knife in the parking lot as well as the red t-shirt. Now, many witnesses saw this man running from the apartment complex, and the maintenance man who was with Tammy said that he believed this man was around 14 to 23 years old because he was kind of short with close cropped hair and a medium build. But investigators knew where to look for his name because when you would go to these areas in these apartment complexes, you had to sign your name to sign in. And so this meant that if the killer used his real name, they could have him. Meanwhile, the public didn't know about this sign-in sheet that they were looking for or the description of him. They just heard about the multiple killings happening in the area, and no one was leaving their doors unlocked. They weren't going for walks. People even began taking baths and showers with guns nearby because they heard that's when the killer was attacking, and it is one of the most vulnerable times you can have when you are naked and have no sort of weapon with you. All investigators were telling the public was that this killer was a disorganized opportunist who basically picked his victims on the spot. So these murders weren't planned, and the murder weapon was often from the victim's home. So a few people even chose to move away when they began hearing all of this, and a resident from this same apartment complex said that there were so many moving trucks up and down the streets of people who were living in the apartment complex where the murders were happening that said that they didn't want anything to do with it and they just left. left. However, even though the whole community was on high alert, the killer would strike again. And even though investigators had gone to this gym to look for the sign-in sheet, they hadn't gotten anywhere because the problem was they found the names of Holly, Tammy, Richard, and a man named C. Prince. Investigators, of course, went to look for who this man could be, and the next day they found a match. This was to a man named Cleophus Prince Jr. He was tracked to his home. He was questioned about his whereabouts the day prior, and he had said that he had been at this gym lifting weights that morning, but he was back around noon so he could get ready for work when he had to leave at 2. Cleophas did appear to match the descriptions given, and he was asked to come down to the station to be questioned and to just, fingerprint him, get some blood, but he said that he would rather not. With no search warrant, no evidence to prove that this was the killer, investigators had to let him go and move on with their investigation. And thankfully, the murders did stop. The Buena Vista Apartments were slowly relaxing. The people inside thought maybe this was the end, no more murders were happening. It had been a month, another body wasn't found, but the truth was the body just wasn't where they thought it would be. You see, there had been a murder on May 21st in East San Diego in one of the top-of-the-hill apartments. Elisa Keller was a 38-year-old mother of an 18-year-old girl, and that weekend her daughter had gone out on her own, and so it was just Elisa. She stayed because she had to work, and she actually didn't show up for work that day or answer her phone, and her daughter headed home and found the front door unlocked. This 18-year-old then had to find her own mother murdered. She was lying on the floor with her legs spread apart and a blanket covering her torso. She was only wearing a tank top and had 9 deep stab wounds to her chest. She was also believed to be punched in the face as well as choked, and she had definitely tried to fight for her life. Her daughter instantly noticed that her mother's golden nugget ring was actually missing from her finger, and investigators had found that there was a partial open window with shoe prints on the sill. Now, this was in the dining room, and these were from the same Nike Air Jordans, but this wasn't fully connected just yet. So as far as the public knew, they were only looking for a killer of 3 victims in Buena Vista, and that was it. There was a composite sketch of the witness statements that was created and sent out to the public for everyone to be on the lookout for, and they were also looking into a possible suspect that was an accused rapist as possibly being this killer, but that wasn't really going anywhere either. Now, the MO continued to change after this, making it even harder to find this man and to connect these murders to him, because 4 months later, it was September 13th, and the Clarkson family didn't live in an apartment like all of the other victims prior. They lived in their own home in University City. This was only about 15 minutes from East San Diego and the last victim, and this was Pamela and Amber Clarkson. They were mother and daughter. They were 42 and 18 years old, and they lived with the whole family. So Pamela was married, Amber's father lived with him, and that day Pamela left around 8 a.m. to go to the family fitness center. Her husband left a few minutes later, leaving Amber home alone. She was still sleeping during this time, so they just let her be. But then Pamela didn't go to work that day. She never showed up, and so one of her coworkers got worried and ended up going to their home. That is when he immediately saw Pamela lying in the doorway. She was completely nude with her arms above her head, her legs together, and investigators found she had been stabbed in the chest 11 times. She had also been drugged to the location of the front door, and the murder weapon was also next to her head, a bloodied knife. But this wasn't the only victim they would find. 18-year-old Amber was half in the hallway, half in her bedroom. She was clothed, but her shirt was lifted to show the 11 stab wounds in her chest as well, just like her mother. She had been murdered in the same exact way, and investigators found that Pamela wasn't wearing her wedding ring anymore. Her purse was on her bed, but no money was in it, and although the front door was wide open, it appeared as though the killer had gotten in a different way because the dining room window was open and the screen was out. There were also shoe prints right under the window, and neighbors came forward saying that around 10 a.m. they heard Amber, or who they thought was Amber, talking to somebody and arguing with them inside the home. Some believe that she called out, some heard a male voice, but around an hour later, Pamela's car was back in the driveway. They thought everything was fine, but it appeared as though she'd walked in on her daughter being murdered and then was murdered herself. The scary part was, if these neighbors had heard this arguing but hadn't heard the actual murder, that meant that this killer could be even more skilled than investigators even wanted to think about. Investigators in the East San Diego area realized they were the problem quickly, and it didn't take them long to connect these 3 new murders with the 3 prior. A task force was created for this specific case with 27 detectives, 5 sergeants, 1 lieutenant, and a police captain who were all working to find this man. They found that the blood on the doorknob that was in that strange honeycomb pattern could have been made from working gloves. Calls were coming in, but more than anything, it was from scared residents just calling to see if they had found anything, made any progress, and there was no new information coming in, just old information. But investigators were slowly finding that even though there weren't more victims, this killer could have possibly been breaking into homes and attempting to attack many women in between these kills, failing to kill them. And it was unknown whether he wanted to or not. You see, we're going to take it back to in between these kills when the 3rd woman was murdered. This was in April of 1990, and a man with this same description of this killer had tried to get into the apartment of a woman named Tiffany Squires at the Torrey's Pines Village. This was around the same area of all of the other apartments, and she said she recognized him, but she didn't know where. It could have been from the description that these witnesses were giving of this killer, but she was at the pool, she made it home to shower, and she made it inside safely. But a neighbor noticed a man following her and trying to open her door and immediately called management and the police. Then, even though this man, ran and nobody got hurt during this time, a few days later, Stephanie's roommate, who was named Sarah, went home from the pool into the apartment, and that is when she noticed that the door handle was moving and somebody was trying to break in. Sarah then called the police and she was safe, but that same day, the apartment manager saw an unfamiliar man walk past her desk, and because of all these murders happening, she decided to tell her husband to go and follow him. Now, he found that this man was driving an old, dirty 2-door Chevrolet or Oldsmobile that was noisy. It had a very loud muffler. And he was able to write down the license plate number, but had no reason to really tell police because they didn't connect him directly to being the man trying to get into these apartments, or definitely not to a murder. So they really had nothing other than a suspicious man. Even today, Black individuals can be looked at as suspicious simply for the color of their skin. So it could have just been simply because they saw a Black man that they found him suspicious. However, in this case, it could have been the killer. Now, while in the midst of all the murders the next month, a man thought to be the killer followed a woman named Leslie Hughes Webb from the La Jolla Shores Beach to her home, tried to get into her home behind her, but she fought him, pushed him over a nightstand, and ran out screaming. And thankfully, he ran out as well through the gate and disappeared. Now, after the 4th murder victim, which was the first in the East San Diego area, there were 3 women who lived in that same apartment complex as victim Eliza Keller, and they were all robbed. Now, the month after the last murder victims we talked about, which were Pamela and Amber, there were several burglaries in this area where women were saying that a man was following them trying to get into their home while they showered. In fact, a month later, Michelle Tate said that she went to the pool and came back home to find her TV and VCR completely gone. The next month, she also saw a man matching this killer's description who asked her if he could carry her groceries and was very aggressive about it when she said no. He made eye contact for almost a minute before letting her go. So there had already been 6 murders, but thankfully there hadn't been one since Pamela and Amber. So it had been around 3 months afterwards. It was December 19th, 1990, and they still hadn't caught the man either. That's when a woman named Patricia Van got home and she heard a knock on the door. The man was asking her for Terry, and she said she didn't know a Terry, but Patricia's neighbor actually came up behind this man and stood behind him and challenged him as to what he wanted. And then he went away. This neighbor told Patricia she had come to help her because she had seen this man looking into backyards, surveying the area, and she just had this weird feeling when he went up to her door. she had gotten the license plate number and the description of his vehicle, which was a gray Chevrolet Cavalier. Then she gave all this to the police. The next month, on January 8th of 1991, Lynn Shadarick went home from the Family Fitness Center where she worked out, and she took her dogs inside and heard them barking at the front door. And that is when the doorknob was moving and she began to hold on to it. And when she looked outside, she saw a man, and he looked at her, then ran away. Little did she know he was going to go on to rob another woman since he couldn't get into her home. And this was Melinda Pinkerton, who arrived home to find her kitchen cabinets open. There was a butcher knife on the counter. Her sliding glass door was open. Her camera and jewelry was missing. And a few weeks later, another woman heard someone trying to break into her place when she had gotten home from a workout at that same center. She immediately jumped into her car and she drove away without even wanting to know what was happening inside. Then Patricia Van, who we talked about prior when her neighbor came and rescued her, actually found her home burglarized as well. A butcher knife was placed on the counter and jewelry was stolen. Now, all of these stolen items began showing up at pawn shops at a local store, and the name they were being pawned under was Rodney Higgs, which was found to be an obvious alias. The next day, 19-year-old Angela Yates was followed home from her workout, and she told her mother she was trying to lose this man. She did get home, and her mother then saw a shadow in the backyard and called the police. Their dog actually went to attack this man and he ran away, and so they were completely safe. But you might be thinking, oh my God, this is never ending, because now he hadn't murdered in a while, but he still appeared to be robbing or trying to get in and possibly attack these women. These women were just on high alert now and did what they needed to get away. Because even with no bodies and no more murders, people in the area were still fearful of a break-in or what this man would do if he got in. That's when on February 1st, police were called to a break-in, and while they were there, they saw another appointment with the screen removed, and they left a note for that person to call them because they believed that they had been robbed, and the other owner returned home to find their items stolen as well. So nobody was even home. So it appeared as though this person wasn't even looking for victims at this point, only to steal. 2 days later, Geraldine Vervital, who worked at the Family Fitness Center as well, went home to shower, and sure enough, she heard the door rattling. She then saw a man outside. She ran out back, she screamed for help, and thankfully her neighbor actually came to her rescue and came to help, and then they went up to the front door and the man was still there trying to break in. He asked this man what he was doing, and he claimed he was just looking for his fiancée, who he saw going into the house, but no one was in the house besides Geraldine. He then just walked away pretending to call out this name, but they ran after the car that he got into as he sped away, and they saw that it was, this old car, and it was very loud. Geraldine was at work the next day when she believed she heard this loud muffler, and she looked up and saw the man in this same car dropping off a girl who worked there as well, who was a receptionist. Geraldine told police, and they basically said to call them if they saw this car again. And so they ended up seeing this car again with this man, and investigators showed up to talk to him, said he had nothing to do with it, he didn't want to come down to the station, and because this, breaking in of Geraldine, he hadn't stolen anything, he hadn't really broken in, he didn't murder anybody, they didn't have anything to hold him in custody for. However, that was until they found what was in his car. You see, while this man was saying that his girlfriend worked there, he was just waiting for her, he was arrested anyways, because inside his car was black leather gloves, wool gloves, a knife with an 8-inch blade, a folding knife, a steak knife, and another folding knife. Investigators realized that this all could have been over much earlier too, because the man they were looking at was one they already knew, Cleophus Prince Jr. But at this point, he agreed to give blood and answer some of their questions. But after this, he was released because, like I said, they didn't really have anything to hold him on besides being in possession of lots of knives and gloves. They planned to watch him, though, to hopefully catch him in the act, and they also had to wait for the results from the blood test to come back. 3 weeks later, they did come back, but Prince was already gone. The man whose DNA matched the crime scenes of 6 murders in San Diego had disappeared. Investigators had gone to his address to talk to them, and they found out that he lived right next to Eliza Keller, the 4th victim, before, of course, he murdered her. While some investigators went to track him down, others searched his home, and they found that there was jewelry from the victims that had been missing inside his home. Not all of it, but enough to know they had the right person, and now they just needed to find him. But this killer couldn't just stop his life and go into hiding, thankfully. And so by March 1st, Prince had actually been arrested for robbing a dance club. This was in Birmingham, Alabama, but he had already been released because a bondsman had already paid his bond. So this man was contacted, and they basically tricked Prince into revealing his location and then asked him to turn himself in. It turned out he was in Alabama to see his family, and he did come in with both of his parents escorting him. Many of the survivors and witnesses were asked to come pick a man out of the lineup, and they all picked Cleophus Prince Jr. He was extradited back to California, and while looking into his life, they found that he was born into a pretty poor family. His father was also in prison for murder by the time he was 2 years old, and he had always told his son that it was self-defense, that he hadn't really murdered anybody. But Cleophas was the oldest of 8 children, and he stayed away from gangs and drugs and did great in school. And as he grew up, everyone said he was so polite. He went into the military, he was passionate about fitness, nothing really out of the ordinary. He got out of the military, and a month before the murders began, he had moved into Buena Vista Gardens apartment with his girlfriend, who was named Carla Lewis, and she was the receptionist at this fitness center. By the second murder, he actually was found to have bragged about forcing himself on a woman during a date and that she was weeping, but he continued anyways. A coworker even mentioned that when Janine was found murdered, he began talking about her, saying that he worked out with her and that they would have sex occasionally, and that the investigators were never going to catch the Claremont Killer, as they were referring to this man as. He was also being referred to as the Prince of Darkness once he was caught, of course, because his name was Prince. When investigators had come to his home to ask him to give blood and he refused, his friends said, "Why don't you just give them blood like they want? Just do as they ask." And he said that they were basically just on a witch hunt, and he wasn't going to do that. Witnesses came forward saying that they had heard Prince saying he enjoyed stalking women, playing with them, letting them believe they would escape, and then doing them. He said he liked to watch the blood drip from the knife onto the victim's private area. He would then go straight to work or, go home and give the stolen jewelry to his girlfriend. He told his friends that he actually would sleep with the girls and take it from them because they wouldn't need it anymore. It was found that he was also dating a woman who lived in University City when the murders began happening around there. He was also working at a place where he used gloves with this honeycomb pattern on it, same as the doorknobs. Prince's shoes were also found to be a match to the shoe prints found at the crime scene. Even with all of this, they wanted to make sure that they could confidently convict him and connect him to all 6 murders to have the best chance at the death penalty. The FBI were involved. They were even helping in the profile to catch this man. Yet at the same time, Prince's parents were claiming that he was being framed. The trial began in 1993, and his girlfriend Carla took the stand. She's claimed that Prince never came home angry or with blood on him, but his prior roommates said the opposite, and that he did all the time, that he would brag about some of his crimes, and the deputy DA said he was a sexual pervert who enjoyed watching blood flow from a woman's breast. So on July 13th of 1993, Prince was found guilty of all 6 murders and 20 burglaries. When he was sentenced to death, he stood and told the victims' families that he did not kill their daughters. He began to say that he saw pictures of the crime scenes and he wasn't emotionless like everyone said he was. He had cried when he saw them. He appealed his sentence in 2007, but this was denied, and he is still on death row at the San Quentin prison. It's also been found that prior to his trial, a guard found a handmade shank in his jail cell. He would often threaten the guards that he was going to kill them. So what do you think made Cleophas Prince Jr. a killer? It was said that his upbringing, besides his father being in prison, was pretty normal to an extent, and it didn't appear as though he had these tendencies when he was younger, or maybe he was just really good at covering them up. Did he also have a reason for going after young white females? Did another white female possibly anger him or break his heart, or was this just anger and pleasure that he took out on girls he thought was pretty? And see, that's the thing. It wasn't that he was a man who was without a woman. He had a woman in his life. Did his girlfriend know about this? Did his friends? Did anybody know that could have stopped this? Could anything have stopped this at all? Or was this a man who was born to kill, who had that in him since he was little, and who just started acting on it when he got older? I'd love to know what you think. I just thought it would be interesting to bring you this case. Somebody also requested that I do it, so I hope I did a good job. But don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.